Hey, welcome back to part 2 of this interview with Patrick Paul O'Neill. If you haven't yet seen part 1, you should go back and watch that one first. I'll link to it. I'll put a card to it or something like that, just so that you know what we're talking about. So we're just going to pick up where we left off. I won't go too far on it because I'm assuming that you saw my introduction for part 1, so you already know something about Patrick. So we'll get to the interview right now, and thank you for supporting what we do.
A story about customer service. That I kind of got to watch Tony do once, which was he had, typically Tony shows his drawings the day of, which for the vast majority of his career has never been an issue. And this one particular day, I think most of the shop was gone on a convention, and I think there's maybe 3 or 4 of us in the shop, and I don't get that alone time with Tony very often. And he was tattooing a young woman who didn't like the composition that he kind of came up with. His idea was to have the dragon head kind of going up at the top, whereas she was very insistent that she wanted to kind of come down towards the hand. And getting to watch that process of compromise and education was really informative to my own career, where he had spent 20 some hours on this drawing. It looked incredible, and yet this person is like, nah, not for it. And he didn't lose his cool. He didn't become attached to the drawing. He just very calmly explained, well, my only concern is that if I were to put this dragon head on the bottom of your arm, do you see how when you take a piece of paper and you fold it, it narrows the image? And so my concern for you is that if I put this dragon on you and I kind of put that around your forearm, it's going to look like an alligator, more or less, because we're kind of like giving it a long, snappy beak. And she's like, well, I still really like it. And so the next line he said has really stuck with me. He said, well, at the end of the day, I'll do what you want. You've been waiting a super long time for me, and that really means a lot to me. And at the end of the day, I want you to be happy. My only concern as to why I don't think this is going to work is because if I do it, I don't think it's going to match the quality of the work that brought you to me in the first place. And in a moment, she was like, oh, okay, now I understand. You actually do genuinely have my best intentions in mind. And the compromise that they ended up coming to was the dragon head was going to go down, but on the upper half of the arm. And just the whole way that he did that one was crazy in itself, where he stenciled the head of the dragon on, and then he just freehands with some markers, and in 3 hours he's got a fully lined dragon sleeve that looks incredible. And I don't know how he did it, but yeah, that story was pretty fun to me.
That's awesome. I was curious about that too. I saw that note, the dragon alligator. Yeah, I don't think not everyone can articulate those types of things to clients as well. It's a lot of times it's just like, well, that's not going to work. It won't look good. It won't whatever. But the to be able to give kind of a visual example of what of what the concern is awesome. Really important too. And then to be able to still kind of pull it off that day, that's where that kind of level of draftsmanship and stuff comes in. So many people, it's tough to draw 20 some odd hours and then shoot a drawing off and then be shot down. And then you feel like, well, I have to be able to use this. I can't not, I'm too invested in it. There's something I have to be able to do. A lot of us would probably in that case just have to reschedule and say, well, it's going to be another 4 months because I have to draw it again and to be able to just like chop it up and make it work again that's super cool.
Well, that's the payoff of being really studious and understanding your structure and your forms is you can kind of like think on the fly a lot more. Whereas myself, I don't have the same experience. Dare I say, I hope to have that level of discipline that's required. Because for me, I'm in the same boat as you. That'd be like, all right, we got to reschedule, right? So that's just another way for me to be encouraged to work harder and to go back to the fundamentals, right? Sorry, any other points that you see here that you want to touch on?
Along that line, I was going to say, my back is being done by Andy Chambers in Virginia, and Andy's bodysuit is being done by Gogwe. And so occasionally he doesn't get it worked on as often as I get worked on, but I'll see the progress kind of being made. And not too long ago. He came in, and for the longest time, he's just had these two kind of lines that were obviously, a dragon up his arm, and I never see the entire thing. I just see these lines, and he came back, I came to his studio recently, and I was like, "Did you go get some work done?" He's like, "Yeah, he did all of this." And I noticed that the lines were now, they had scales in them, and there's a big bend that comes out and back, and then the scales follow perfectly. The scallops become, longer, more elongated as they come forward, and as it turns back, the scales get scrunched, like they would in perspective. And Andy's like, he didn't draw the scales at all. He just started tattooing them. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, I think I'm pretty good at drawing scales. It doesn't take me long on a sketchbook to lay out scales the way that they should be. But no markers, no anything, just breaking out a 3-liner basically, and just like laying these flawless scales as they follow the terrain of this dragon. It's like, how many times do you think that he's done that, Andy? That's incredible that he can pull that off.
Yeah, there's a magic about that guy. Actually, if you don't mind, I might want to pop in with another story there.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I would need a whole separate podcast to tell you about my guest spot to Grants Pass. I'm not sure if you've had this experience of like meeting celebrities and quite frankly just being disappointed, right? Maybe that's because I was younger and I was naive, but it was maybe they weren't as kind as I would have imagined. They weren't as receptive. Mind you, a lot of those times I'm infringing on their boundaries, and I'm just like going up to them in public when I'm a teenager. I'm in my early 20s, but that was an experience that I actually walked away respecting the man tremendously more. And one of the particular highlights of that trip that I'd like to just maybe mention now, and I can share the rest for another time, or if you want to talk more about that, we can. I booked off so much time today to do this with you. So there was one day, I think it was like maybe the third or fourth day, and at the end of the day, Jeff says, "Patrick, do you mind if I show you the tattoo I did today?" Because there seemed to be a culture of gifting your tattoo to other people, right? Which is a value that I've never kind of had. People just walk over and look at it. Whereas to them, it's like, no, this is private. This is intimate. I've asked my client, may I please show the tattoo I did on you to, someone else. And it was a really beautiful koi, and I think there were some chrysanthemums on it. And they'd freehanded the whole thing that day, and they had tattooed it. I had been working on a foo dog, and then meanwhile, Laura had been working on some cherry blossoms. So later on that night, we go out for dinner, and I'm kind of telling them a story about the person who was kind of ahead of me. He was like Tony's other student, who I had always kind of compared myself to. And I suppose this story can kind of be summed up with, just be yourself and don't try to be the second best version of anybody else. So, I won't say his name because I know he's going to be embarrassed, but so Tony's other student is an unbelievably gifted artist, and he's more than upheld Tony's standard, I suppose, with the work that he's doing. And for a long time, I had kind of compared myself to him, and I'd always give myself some excuses as to, why I wasn't drawing as much as he was, or, why I wasn't disciplined as much as he was. And I had a little bit of a complex about, being compared to someone, we both had the same opportunities of studying under a world-class artist. Like, why is he so much better than me? And it was really frustrating because I couldn't point the finger at anybody else. It was all on me. And one night I had asked a coworker, he was a realism artist, and he worked next to, another world-class realism artist. And there was a little bit of a gap between the two of them in terms of experience. So I asked Kevin, I said, Kevin, how do you like manage to work next to George all the time and not just get, bummed out? Like, he's so good, and it's difficult to, sometimes it's difficult to be humble around people like that. And Kevin gave me some of the best advice in my life. He said, well, why would I want to be a second place George when I can be a first place Kevin? And I love that idea. And just to go back to Grants Pass, that particular night, we had went out for dinner, and I showed them this particular person's work, the person I was kind of jealous of. And I was like, look how amazing this is. And in my head, I'm thinking like, this is what I'm up against. And they're like, oh yeah, it's really cool. And then on the way after dinner, Jeff played a very, very interesting trick on me. So he says, Patrick, I'm kind of bummed out today. And I said, oh, why is that, Jeff? He's like, well, because I brought my client over to you guys, and Laura was working on this amazing cherry blossom sleeve, and meanwhile you have this amazing like food dog that you were working on. All I had was just some koi fish and some flowers. And to me this is crazy that he's saying these things. I'm like, so I just stopped him, like, Jeff, like, what are you talking about? And at this point we were walking down the street, and I had to stop him from walking to explain something to him. I said, Jeff, don't compare yourself to either of us. That's ridiculous. Like, it's that would be like William Bouguereau comparing himself to like Alphonse Mucha, comparing himself to like J.C. Leyendecker. Like, the three of them are doing completely different things. And then he looked at me and he said, exactly. Don't compare yourself to other people. He played a trick on me. He basically made me give myself the advice that I needed at that moment.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, he got me on that one.
Yeah, it's difficult though, particularly whenever you're looking at, it's someone who's doing a similar style of work, and what that you're trying to work in, and and you feel like that they're solving some problems more creatively than you are. You feel stuck that you're making the same types of marks over and over, and they're not evolving at the at the way that you want it. And then you're looking at other people's work, and you're like, God, the only way that I know to like to push myself in that way is just to steal that thing from them, because they've done a great job of it. And then once you steal it from them, it's like, well, that doesn't make you feel any better. It doesn't fit, for one thing. Yeah. It doesn't work. It's a challenge. It's something that I've focused this workshop that I've taught probably 10 or 12 times now. This Find Your Style workshop is exactly about that problem, and just ideas on how to solve it.
Well, what's interesting to that is you're also, if you're just taking a bunch of tricks from other people's bags, you're creating a border of yourself to kind of work within, where like now if you're not finding like your own system and your own appreciation for clouds, and you're always relying on what someone else does, those are the borders of your creativity that moment. Like one thing that I see happening a lot in tattooing, and you let me know if you kind of feel this way, is there are these established, we'll call them masters for a moment, whatever their particular style might be. And once they introduce a new, word or phrase into their visual vocabulary, all of a sudden everybody else, kind of starts taking it too, where, this one established artist from Japan might start putting like, lines across the belly of the dragon. And now people see that and they're like, oh, I can do that. And now they start to kind of incorporate that. Or, I'll see someone do like a lotus that has negative lines with yellow, and then once that one guy does it, everybody sees that as a possibility within their work. So I can understand taking someone else's cues, as a temporary measure to kind of study from. But I think ultimately, like, if you're, I've made the mistake of using them as crutches, and in fact they kind of end up poisoning your process. Whereas I think like the moments that have given me like the best growth in my process is one where I have to kind of just like sit down and make those discoveries for myself. Like, don't look at, how other people do chrysanthemum leaves. Like, just research Chinese traditional paintings on chrysanthemum leaves, or go to the grocery store and buy a chrysanthemum and really evaluate the structure and familiarize yourself with the shapes and work with those like really simple shapes, so that in that way you can express them in your own way, and like in genuinely your own way, which you can't really control. I feel sometimes you can't really control what your style is, I believe. I'm interested in, maybe that's a question I'd like to ask you. Do you think that you have control over your own style?
No, I don't. I think that a lot of times, tattooers in particular, we because we feel the need to render everything, we pay so much attention to every element of, every square inch of every piece. I think a lot of times we get caught up in the technical process of tattooing, and it makes it difficult to like kind of let loose on that side of it, and make more kind of genuine marks. And that's why I think it's so important in the prep, in your study outside of tattooing, and how you're preparing for the tattoos, and working in mediums. I love to work in mediums that don't allow me to make the marks that a tattoo machine makes. So a chrysanthemum is a great example. Like, I think I could more easily find my unique kind of marks that describe a chrysanthemum by dragging oil paint in as few strokes as possible across a canvas to try to describe, the turn of a petal, or the distance of one petal to another, or how the edge falls out on a distant petal versus how clean I make the foreground petal, because I don't have that tedious kind of attachment to it that tattooing kind of requires. And then once I've made those marks in that way, sometimes it gets easier for me to like relax and translate it to tattooing, so I don't feel that that need to render so fully. So I think particularly with beginning tattooers, or not particularly but not just with beginning tattooers, you get so caught up in what it takes to make a tattoo that it's hard to like discover what your actual marks are.
Well, I might want to just touch upon like the creative process for that. And I don't know if you were intentionally, sorry, I don't know how intentional this sort of tangent is, but I hope you'll appreciate it. Getting caught up in trying to really refine your work is a really interesting point there. I have a tattoo that I did, and I have to be very careful how I describe it, because the person I did it on might be listening to this. But I'll put it this way: I over-rendered a design on an iPad, and if I'm dealing with, all right, I'm going to show you a picture of my dog that my wife painted. We're going to use this as an example. All right, this is our dog Kenji. So let's just imagine. Let's replace this with a dragon and a phoenix, just for a moment. When you're designing something on a flat piece of paper, you're comparing this end to this end, and you're comparing that to over here and that to over there. When in reality, with a tattoo, you're really only dealing with like that much of the plane at once, right? Like if you're doing a full sleeve. And what ended up happening with that drawing was I put it on the arm, and it was incredibly, I think I did a great job with rendering it. I think it looked really polished, and I think that the photos of it look fantastic. But in real life, it looks flat. It looks as if there's like I'm just like ignoring like large shapes. Realistically, there are some parts that are way too dark, which in the context of that bigger drawing were fine. And it left me really unsettled. And the next day I was speaking to one of my coworkers, and he's a master at neo-traditional Asian tattoos, and I asked him, how do you get away with just like your line work? Like not only when explaining that to your client, but like for myself, I thought that being prepared meant rendering everything, like really going into it. And his answer was pretty simple. He basically said, just do the line work and let the body tell you what to do afterwards. But how I've processed that, and perhaps this is the meatier part of the story, is that the process that was then encouraged, or at least I was encouraging to myself, was, okay, well, what if I have to let circumstance and random chance kind of like guide the experience? And what if, like, being responsible in my process is trying to really take tattooing for what it is, and it's not something that's meant to be on an iPad, it's something that's meant to be on the human body. So I should be really listening and cluing into what the human body has to tell me. So the approach that I'd since taken was, okay, I'm going to design my line work, but I'm not going to become too attached to it. I'm going to, let's say, design 70% of it and kind of like on the shoulder cap, for the next sleeve I might do, or kind of on the edges. I'm going to leave that up to chance and mystery and circumstance. So then the next project that I did was I just designed the line work, I put it on, I photographed it, and then I let that be the guide that I drew over top of. Because then I'm forced to respond to like the bicep. I'm forced to respond to like, the ditch, the elbow, the brachioradialis, because, everybody's, that transition from like the top to the bottom is different for everybody. And you can choose to embrace or ignore, that particular part for the given project. And, what I found was happening after that point was I was allowing the body to be a part of the creative process, almost as if it's its own third independent party. There's, myself, there is, what my patron kind of imagines this piece is going to be. There's the limitations of the medium of tattooing, but then there's also, what, the body is telling me. And then behind all that, there's also, for lack of a better word, like a creative energy or a spirit, or you might kind of want to just call it like your life experience that's kind of forcing you to draw something in a certain way. And all those things kind of have to come together and work. And there's a lot of compromises that kind of have to be done throughout that process, which I think are kind of beautiful, I suppose.
Yeah. I agree.
Any thoughts on that you can think of?
Yeah, I agree. I love that kind of description, and the problem, going back to that kind of obsession to render everything and get it perfect, is because tattoos have been judged for so long based on their technical quality. How clean are the lines, how solid are the fields of color, how smooth are the blends, and even clients know to judge based on that criteria. But the problem, whenever you when you pay attention, when you treat everything as if it's the focal point, or as if it's the most important thing, then nothing becomes the most important thing. It's like trying to look across the room, trying to look at the bookshelf behind you and look at all of the books. I can't do it. I'm just going to find a book and look at it. There's no way I can focus on all the books. And so but it takes a lot of courage, I think, to be able to do, what you're talking about with your friend who lets the line weight, be what it is. Or you look at, I've only seen one kind of big Philip Liu bodysuit in person, but what I would consider one of the most important areas of the torso was just this huge, big sweeping wave, but there were no finger waves in it. It was just a big area of a big mass of gray that swept the chest. And to be such a important area of the body, or of the bodysuit, in my opinion, I thought that it was neglected. It was just like, at first glance, just seeing that piece of it, I was just like, that's weird that he didn't do anything with that entire chunk of that torso. And but then, of course, I'm just seeing some pieces of this tattoo, and then as I see the tattoo as a whole through, the person is showing me Instagram photos of the entire process and all that, and it's like, oh yeah, I see that's not where he was trying to drive attention, but it was pretty bold to neglect that huge important area of the body.
Yeah.
So
well, on that note, then that brings to mind composition. Like, what's something that I'm so curious as to what your thoughts are on this, is how the medium of tattooing, like the tattoos that I see, I suspect are now so informed by the means in which the public is looking at tattoos, where often when I get like a set of references from my clients, it will be, inner forearm subject, inner bicep subject, outer bicep, outer forearm. And it almost seems as if there's like an intentional kind of like division in the arm, where we've kind of divided into four equal pieces. And we think that there needs to be like a subject for those specific, we'll call them like plinths or platforms that you're putting a sculpture on top of, right? And of course that's convenient for a photo. It makes for a really easy photo when you just have, like a Hanya mask or one subject on your inner forearm, and you can take a photo. It's really easily digestible. It works great for the medium of photography, but that's not really what a tattoo is, right? So the best tattoos I've always suspected, and what I think you're kind of suggesting Philip is doing here, is getting rid of that idea of like sections or quarters, and that really it should kind of be flowing throughout those parts, and should really be responding to the rhythm of the body. And like you said, it's having the courage to have someone be like a background actor, right? You have to have the supporting cast. You can't just have 12 leading actors. It doesn't work like that, right? That's my thoughts on that.
Yeah. In back to Jeff, Gogwe, one of the things I remember, and I haven't watched that interview in a long time, so I may be getting it wrong, but we were talking about maybe starting a back piece, and he said that, if they have a tattoo on their calf, that's where I'll start designing the back piece, because that kind of already is. And when he said that, it kind of struck me, because I thought, well, you don't know if you're going to go down the leg or not, but he just assumes that he will, and even if not, at least there's that starting point. And the more that I've thought about that, and the more that I've kind of tried to use that approach, it's actually much easier than starting with nothing, because there's a shape at the top of that calf, and whatever that shape is, if you repeat it, you've solved the first problem. Like, you repeat a shape, and it creates some type of a rhythm, that's, whether or not it actually ever attaches. It's like rather than starting with it like this endless, you know these endless options on how to start the tattoo, you've limited your number of options right off the bat to, I'm going to start by mimicking the top of that shape, if that's what you choose to do, however you choose to address the thing that's already there. It's like, well, if that thing kind of does this, then I'm going to go to the base of or top of the butt, and I'm going to kind of repeat that shape, because 8 inches lower or 12 inches lower, there's that shape. And at least that's something to start with.
Yeah.
So it's actually much easier to take that approach than it is to ignore it.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Like, I think that I can suffer from choice paralysis sometimes, and you're right. Like, having an answer kind of like, I kind of want to say it's almost like spoon fed to you. Like, the shape in that area is almost like being spoon fed to you on a silver platter. And you're right. It's really easy to kind of like, work from that point onwards. Whereas otherwise, if you're starting off with like your main subject, and then you got to kind of find a way to merge those two towards the end of the composition, a lot of the time, like, you're having to like shoehorn shapes to make it work in there. And it always, I find it draws more attention to that area than it does away a lot of the time. Because I think the other thing, like repeating a shape, now that I'm thinking about it, is, if I'm not mistaken, that then provides less contrast to that area, because you're just having repeating shapes. Whereas if you have, a completely different set of shapes that you're trying to kind of merge, that's more shape contrast, right? And so then your eye is going to go there, more often than not. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I never thought about that.
Yeah. I don't know that I ever had either until he mentioned it, and that seemed to me like an extreme example, and that's about as extreme of an example as you can get. If they want something on their upper back and you're starting with their calf,
Yeah.
it is pretty extreme, but it is a starting point that you didn't have to think so much about. It's one less decision that you have to make. Andy Chambers does it in a way where he uses the vanishing points, where the tattoo breaks the line of sight, and he uses the viewer's perspective. So he's like, if someone is 6'3" and I'm tattooing their upper back, whatever I draw, I'm going to be looking up at it, because most people are looking up at someone that's 6'3", shoulder, and if it's on a calf, I'm almost always going to draw it from the perspective of looking down at it, because that's how people experience it. No one lays down on their belly and looks at a calf straight on. And I think his example was, if I'm doing, people want a dragon head on the back of their calf, and people do it looking, the artist lays it out looking straight forward. And he's like, nobody gets down and sees it that way. He like, draw it looking down at the dragon, because that's how everyone experiences it. And that's one less problem you have to solve. You've solved your perspective right there.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Absolutely. So I was hoping to describe, because earlier, I kind of spoke about like some stories that I'd like to share. And one that I wouldn't mind kind of sharing, and just to kind of get clear what my intention is I'm someone that has suffered from a lot of like imposter syndrome. I have a really big amount of anxiety. Like, just doing this is like crazy scary. Like, just opening yourself up to the world is crazy scary, but there's value in doing things that you're terrified of, because it's probably not going to kill you, and it teaches you that you're able to kind of handle it. And tattooing has offered me many moments like that. And this is, yet another one. This is going to become a new story in the future for me. Was when I started traveling to get tattooed and doing guest spots. So it was 2019. It was early 2019. At that point, I was overworking myself. I got like a little bit of like the craft beer bug. That's a very light way of saying that I was like a functional mild alcoholic. You know, but to put it kindly, I would say I didn't have the healthiest relationship, I think, with alcohol. And the effects of that is it makes your anxiety a lot worse. So there were some days that I was tattooing that if it feels like the whole day during your session, it feels like it's the same sort of like rush in your head as when you're just about to take a university exam, like that level of stress for a whole session. Um, and there kind of became a point where I was kind of getting sick of myself. I was like, man, like why am I not like why am I so afraid to do these things? And there's one day that I just happened to be, you know, drunk, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna send an email to an artist that lives in another country that I don't think I deserve to get a tattoo from. So I typed out this stuff to this artist. I was like, hey, I just want to get this thing on my leg. You can do whatever the hell you want. And beep, send it away. Bam. You know, now I've kind of locked myself in. You know, I kind of, you know, forgot that it happened. The next day I wake up, I'm sober, and beep, beep, there comes the email. I'm like, oh no, now I have to commit. I can't. And this is someone that I really admire. This is an artist that I really admire in the UK. And I was like, all right, I guess I gotta get myself together to, you know, book an Airbnb, and I gotta book a flight. And at the time I had like a horrifying fear of traveling. Like, you know, I've traveled to a couple different countries in the world, and I have like a very illogical fear that while I'm on a guest spot or while I'm in another country, I'm going to be like accused of some crime, and they're just going to like take me away and put me in the slammer, and you know, I'll be on the news, and the prime minister is going to be talking about wanting to free me, right? Things like that. And, you know, when in reality, there's nothing crazy about going overseas and getting tattooed. You're just booking a plane ticket and booking an Airbnb, and you're on your way. And that particular trip, you know, I flew to London, England. I made the mistake of like arriving a few hours before my session, which is like, man, if there was a delay, I would have missed the appointment. But, you know, just getting there and completely being on my own. Like I had no one to rely on. It was just me, you know, get to the studio and tough it out. And I had an incredible experience getting tattooed, and seeing how, you know, this woman operated, and you know, how well organized she was, how efficient she was at her tattooing, the quality of the experience, you know, it left me completely satisfied. And I ended up, you know, running into a friend of mine that happened to be in London at the same time. And, you know, myself, I was, you know, drinking too much. I was, you know, dysfunctional. I was a bad communicator. You know, I didn't, you know, understand boundaries. And meanwhile, this guy that I happened to meet up with, you know, he's in great shape. You know, he stopped smoking, and he's like, you know what? I think I'm going to have a kid in a few years. And I'm thinking to myself, like, you know, I think he said 2 years. And I'm thinking to myself, like, man, I'm barely responsible enough to take care of myself. And you think that you can take care of another human being? That's incredible. And that process kind of started a chain reaction of encouraging myself to do things before I thought I was ready. So for example, when it came to, you know, doing a guest spot, I told myself there are 3 studios that I really want to go to do guest spots: 26 Swords, Raven and the Wolves, which is Carlos Torres, and State of Grace. So, you know, shortly after that trip, I was like, you know what? Let's just see if we can get 2 in a row. Let's see if we can get 2 big life-changing things in a row. So I sent an email off to 26 Swords, not so much to get the guest spot, but really what the intention of it was to get used to being told no, and seeing that being told no maybe isn't as bad of a thing as you think. So I sent it off, and while I was waiting for their response, I had the pleasure of doing a consultation with a gentleman named Mark from Long Beach, California. And, you know, during my long consultations, I asked, like, so what does he do for a living? And he mentioned, he's like, oh, I work at Raven and the Wolves in Long Beach, California. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's Carlos Torres' studio. I was like, what? That's so cool. And so, you know, Mark and I worked on a great project, and, you know, he'd put in a good word for me, and it opened the door to eventually, you know, book a guest spot at Raven and the Wolves. And not too long after, you know, I started tattooing Mark, surely enough, 26 Swords gets back to me, and they're like, hey, we love your work. Come on by. And I had all this like pent up fear of thinking my work wasn't good enough, or, you know, that I shouldn't be traveling. And yet all it was just like an email and a conscious, introduction and a collection of my portfolio. And surely enough, it put me on the path to, getting to work to, next to one of the artists that I've really admired for a long time. And we didn't really end up talking about tattooing at all. We talked about life for the most part. And those were the things that kind of, really woke me up, I suppose, or started to wake me up.
Yeah, yeah. And so you think your health started to change at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I suppose it encouraged me that there's value, there's tremendous value in trying to overcome like your personal boundaries, and that if you can overcome your personal boundaries, it gives you the confidence to work on your professional boundaries, whether that be, and I'm not referring to interpersonal boundaries, but rather it teaches you that there's value in pushing yourself to the limit of what you're comfortable for, and that there are really great tangible benefits to pushing yourself. And it doesn't need to be like these, it doesn't need to be abstract, or when you listen to like your heroes talk about like the steps that they kind of took to get to where they are, like you don't consider the consequences and the successes of those events really being something that you can participate in. But surely enough, if I've just been lucky enough to have some experiences tell me like, oh yeah, if you actually try to better yourself as a person and you're brave and you apply yourself, you can go do guest spots where you don't think you're ready for. You can get tattooed by people you don't think you're ready for. You can make better art. You can talk to better people. You can be on a podcast that you've been listening to since you were an apprentice yourself. So
Yeah.
a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah, definitely. And they aren't leaps, necessarily to get there, to make those changes. And most of the time you don't even recognize, that they're happening. I was thinking about this. My wife and I ran a 10K, and I've run on and off throughout my life. We ran a 10K recently, and anytime that I've been training for a race, 5K, I did a full marathon in Amsterdam some years back, and I trained. You know what I mean? I found a training schedule, and I tried to follow it, and I pushed myself, and it may end up injured or sore, or plantar fasciitis, or nagging things. In this last this St. Jude 10K, I'd never run one with my wife before, and she doesn't train and compete like the way that I have through my life. And so we just started, I started doing walk runs with her. So we would do 5 minutes of a slow jog and 2 minutes of a walk, and 5 minutes of a jog and 2 minutes of a walk. And we ended up accumulating a lot of miles that way. And then sometimes if I felt great at the end of it, I would do a quick little extra mile or two, kind of at a fast clip, just to exhaust myself or whatever. But for the most part, the entire training regimen was really, really relaxed and not much. And so we went and did this 10K that I didn't really train all that hard for, but I was very consistent, and I was healthy, and I wasn't injured. And I finished the 10K about 8 minutes faster than I had anticipated that I was shooting for. And you look back at it and you're like, well, that was a surprising result, because I didn't really push myself the way that I thought was necessary. I just enjoyed the experience, and because I enjoyed it, I committed more time to it. I logged more miles. My body was probably stronger because of those miles, even though they weren't miles maybe in my anaerobic or aerobic heart rate zones or whatever I might be looking for. They were conversational miles. I was able to talk through all the runs, but they resulted in a better performance than I might have suspected. So I think a lot of times you're intimidated by a lot of, like if I could just get that guest spot, or if I can just get that piece, or if I can just make that connection back with me starting this podcast, it was like, if we could just get Guy Aitchison on, that'll be the turning point for the show. And it's like, there's not a guest that's a turning point for the show. It's the consistency of doing the show for 10 years that's the turning point for the show. And if you think about it that way, it's actually not even hard. It's like pretty easy to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I think that idea of kind of like demystifying the process, mm-hmm. where it's not these like romantic gestures, or it's not these super huge turning points that have kind of helped me. It's just been, of course, those end up, you do have moments like we were discussing earlier where they do kind of like become like the awakening of a new idea that then becomes permanent. But those things come few and far between, and like the much more important part is trying to be disciplined enough to just try every day, because that's really hard. Just trying every day is really, really hard. And like any sort of success that I've gotten, it's always been through like incredibly boring means. It's nothing dramatic, but if you slow down and you appreciate it, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And so I'm curious for yourself, because when I listen to the early Fireside podcast, which I did yesterday, I think I listened to one from like 2013. There's a very different version of you there. Very different version of you. So I'm curious, how have you found that this sort of like professional venture that you've had, how is it in turn informed your own personal development?
Oh, I don't know that I can even answer that. Probably in more ways than I even comprehend. It's what I've found is, back when we started in 2013, there wasn't nearly the level of information sharing or openness even in the industry. Instagram, if it was around or if I knew about it, it was, in its infancy. And so I wasn't seeing the quality of work. So probably my idea of what tattooing was in 2013 was drastically different than what it is now. I was working at a shop, and I had never even met anyone that worked in, let's say, a private studio where they kind of crafted an experience, a customer experience. It was whatever the shop experience you inherited whenever you got a booth there. And so there were just so many things about, like, just some of the ideas that we've talked about today that I wasn't even aware of. I was just trying to, I think the goal originally was just to, like, help kind of take some of the pressure off of beginning tattooers or apprentices, or just share ideas with my friend David, back and forth, which, the thing is David and I worked together. He still works at my studio on the days that I'm not there, so we don't work together. We share one station, but we've worked together over 20 years, so we weren't really learning anything new about each other. Everything that we talked about in those early first 100 episodes, where it was just the two of us, I already knew what his opinion was on that topic, and he already knew what mine was on that topic. We were just getting together and drinking Jameson and sharing it with everybody else, or whoever, with the 12 or 20 people that watched at that point. And so I don't know. I don't know that I can even. I don't know how I could even answer the question. I think that just my world has changed so much, or my understanding of what this whole what tattooing and and visual art and relationships and what all this stuff is even about. I just didn't have a good grasp on it. Yeah.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean, but I don't think that I was in the minority there. I think in 2013. Almost everyone was in that boat. It wasn't that long ago, but from a tattooing standpoint, it was like a lifetime ago. It's 10 years. You think about 10 years as a blip, and it did blow by. But if you look at just how the industry, the medium, the technologies that we're using, the education level of our clients, all of it has really changed. It's not that I was in the dark and there were a bunch of other people out there who weren't. Yeah. I think we all were. So.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that I hope you can really understand and appreciate, and not feel too awkward about when I compliment you on this, is like the role that communities such as yours have to the industry, at least from my perspective, is Admittedly, I'm going to present a pretty cynical view of where, at least what I'm kind of seeing, and then what I think Fireside is doing to kind of combat this is, some days I open my phone, I can be a little bit bummed out as to how different tattooing is now than it was when I first started. Where I back in 2013, I'll keep the ranting about social media pretty short, but back in 2013, it seemed as if tattooing, or back in 2014 or 15, it was just like an exchange of ideas, and like every day you were just blown away by how someone had just like broken another wall into what was possible in terms of like visual communication. Whereas nowadays, I don't see that happening nearly as much. And I saw a tattoo that a guy, pardon my language, took a piss on a wall and then he photographed it, and then he outlined the pee stain, and then he stenciled that on someone, and then he tattooed that on someone. So tattooing has, like, on social media has kind of gone from this like really beautiful exchanges of like ideas and of like, again, visual language and new things to appreciate, to now desperately trying to like milk a stone to get like a chance at, you know, having your voice heard amongst other people. And, you know, on some days, on my more cynical days, I'll kind of look at it as like almost like a race to the bottom. But then on my more generous days, I think of it as like, we're all just trying to survive, man. Like, and this is the game that we're given to work with. And, you know, those people are, I should be hesitant when, you know, passing judgment. Right. But what what Fireside has at least given to me, and how it's been described to very many other people, is it's helped in two ways. First of which is and I'll speak to the lesser of the 2 points, is for one, it listening to podcasts like this, it helps you stay alert and stay critical. Like you're, you know, I found that during the quarantine, not having anybody to like talk to about art, you know, going back into it after COVID, I was thinking like, I wasn't thinking nearly as critically about like shape relationships, line weight. I had to kind of like regain a large part of that understanding. And, you know, regularly listening, just on a practical sense, helps you kind of keep up to date with that just as much as like, you know, talking to a couple of the guys in your shop who are, you know, really nerdy about, you know, design or machines, whatever have you. But second of all is, I think that, you know, you're helping carry the literal like spirit of tattooing, or like the human quality of it. Like, we're living in an age now where like we have so many things lined up against us. We have, you know, an oversaturated market. We have a public who I believe is partially becoming exhausted of looking at tattoos. We're up against everything else. Like I have to compete with like a baking shop to get your eyes on my work, right? We have pigment bans in Europe, and now we have AI art, right? And each one of these problems seems so much bigger than last, and it's really easy to, you know, to get kind of scared of the circumstances, right? But, you know, what, for myself, like the newest thing that I'm thinking of is like, well, what role will artificial intelligence kind of have in the tattoo market, and how is it going to change it even more? I can't guess. But, you know, for all of my grumbling about it, you know, my wife, who's much wiser than I, she says, well, just try to capitalize on what can AI never offer. And that's ultimately like a human experience that's like, you know, almost like an exchange of love and empathy and compassion. And I think what you're providing is exactly that. Like you're sharing stories, you're sharing values, you're sharing perspectives which empower other people. You know, your guests or yourself, you might give, you know, that missing little part to someone that needs it, that, you know, they might not remember that you're the one that said it. They might not remember, you know, that it was who the guest was, but like you said, like, you know, I once heard this one guy talk about so-and-so, and that, you know, that this is one of the many petri dishes where ideas come together and something new can kind of, you know, grow from it and then propagate to the rest of the world, I suppose.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I never wanted to come on here and pretend that I was right, or give the idea that my guests were right. You know, I loved going to, going to conventions and having someone on, a traditional tattooer who had, you know, a specific kind of mindset, and then having the very next guest 30 minutes later on who presented a completely different concept, different idea, and trying, like I said earlier, just meet both of them where they are, explore their ideas further, and maybe offer a counterpoint if it's useful, but not to prove that they're wrong and I'm right, you know, because I think that's one of the problems in my early years of tattooing, is that everyone, you know, we believe in our mentors so much because it was, you know, it's all you had, you know, and so you believed everything that they had to say. And I felt like early on, that was one of the things that I needed to combat, was that, you know, your mentor was useful and helpful to you, but they probably weren't right on all of this stuff, you know. Yeah. So it's important to important to keep that in mind. And I think that's what, if there's anything that's been consistent through the years of the show, I hope that that's, that's what it is that, when someone comes, and there are mean people on YouTube for sure that'll have, that disagree with something, and rather than just disagreeing, they want to be mean, about it. But I try to like not answer those comments when I first see them, not have a knee-jerk reaction. And if I either ignore them altogether, if they are being mean for the sake of being mean, or if they're actually trying to make a counterpoint, addressing the counterpoint and not addressing the attitude that I know came from their mentors, because that's just the way that the tattooing has always worked. It just, that stuff is kind of passed down that way.
Well, one skill that I've had to learn the older that I get, and I think it's speaking to what you're referring to, is knowing the danger that comes with unsolicited advice, which I didn't quite understand when I was younger, because if you're passionate about art, you're like desperate to talk about it, and I think that, looking back at it, I can kind of admit that I was someone that I think gave a lot of unsolicited advice, and it didn't come from a bad place. It wasn't that I was trying to prove that I was better than anybody else, but rather it was like, hey man, I care about you, and I really care about art, and like, let's talk about art. And I kind of just I was using like these suggestions as a way to like open the door to kind of talk about, a particular visual concept. But I've kind of had to learn throughout the years that not everyone needs your help. And then two is that you might not have the missing piece that they particularly need at that moment, right? Like you might completely miss the mark, or you might be bringing up an issue that they're already aware of, and you're just going to make them feel more bad about it, or, you don't even know if what you're sharing is going to be true or not, right? Like I could give someone a piece of advice that I think is, genius, and then like 4 years later I found out that I was completely wrong about it. And so now I've imprinted a bad habit or a bad perspective in someone just as well. So, I've really had to, so those guys that are, kind of mean and, saying all these things to you, that's a bit of a bummer, but my only hope is that they can see that in the end, none of this stuff should be taken that seriously. We're just drawing on people, and it's really more just about, is the client happy? Is the artist happy? Then guess what? They're living their best life in that moment.
Hey, you made it through the entire thing. I hope you got something out of it. I really did. I enjoyed the conversation. Patrick is actually, if I didn't mention it in the last episode, going to be doing a technique talk with us in the Inside Fireside Tattoo Club, May the 17th, I believe. And so if you'd like to learn more about Patrick, if you'd like to be able to probe and ask some questions on your own, then we would love to have you in the Inside Fireside Tattoo Club. There are tons of benefits. I talked about it at the end of the last episode. If you happen to be in the Tattoo Club and you missed the technique talk with Patrick, we save all of them, we record them, and we post them inside the Tattoo Club. So they're not available on YouTube, but they are available to Tattoo Club members. All of our technique talks are. So it's a whole different kind of rabbit hole that you can get into in the world of Fireside. We go a lot deeper in these talks into design and technique and reading the skin and machines that we're using and inks that we're using and a lot of stuff that we don't get into that much on YouTube. So be sure to check it out. I'll link to it here somewhere. Thank you again for supporting what we do, and we'll catch you soon on the Fireside Tattoo Network.